March, Book 3, pages 16 through 46. 16th Street Baptist Church was the headquarters of the movement in Birmingham, but this Sunday was its annual Youth Day, and it had been packed with young people. Once the smoke cleared, 21 children lay injured. 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair, were dead. 4 little children murdered in the house of the Lord. How could our quest for human dignity spawn such evil? September 18th, 1963. This afternoon we gather in the quiet of this sanctuary to pay our last tribute to these beautiful children of God. These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity, and yet they died nobly. They are the martyred heroes of a holy crusade for freedom and dignity. And so this afternoon, in a real sense, they have something to say to each of us in their deaths. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murders. We all knew what Dr. King meant. Governor George Wallace had started his term declaring segregation forever, and 2 weeks before the bombing, he was quoted in the paper saying, "What this country needs is a few first-class funerals." Unless we could give all its citizens a political voice, Alabama would continue to elect people like Wallace. That evening after the funeral, Diane Nash and I met with Dr. King to present a plan. She and James Bevel were now married and raising a little girl of their own. News of the bombing had shaken them up so badly that she came to Birmingham to propose an all-out revolution. "Dr. King, when children are murdered, we can tell people not to fight only if we offer them a way by which justice can be served without violence." Some in SCLC had talked about marching to Montgomery to place a funeral wreath on the Alabama State House, but Diane's plan went far beyond. Her action in Montgomery would recruit a non-violent army of thousands of young people to pour into the capital city, cutting off roads, trains, airports, phone lines, electricity, and local businesses until the state government was completely shut down. There were 2 objectives: force Governor Wallace out of office, and allow every adult in Alabama to vote. I agree, Diane, but an undertaking of this magnitude would take significant resources. We have to do something. We have to give people a direction, a constructive outlet for their pain and frustration. And we will, but not this way. I wasn't angry with Dr. King. I knew he had other concerns to weigh. But we couldn't do nothing. We had to respond, even if it was just SNCC acting on its own, as we had many times before. So we decided to step up our activities in a small city in a Dallas County, deep in the Alabama Black Belt, where Bernard Lafayette and others had spent the last year organizing to register black voters. Selma. "Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?" January 20th, 2009. "O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." Thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. President. Go ahead, John. Lead the way. Thank you. March, Book 3. Written by John Lewis and Andrew Aydin. Art by Nate Powell. Jim Clark was the sheriff of Dallas County. He was mean, violent, and easily provoked. He was made all the more dangerous by the sundry gang of white men he deputized for the sole purpose of doing whatever it took to stop black people from voting. From poor laborers to wealthy landowners, Sheriff Clark and his posse often carried cattle prods, and they did not use them on cows. When Bull Connor put out a call for reinforcements during Dr. King's campaign in Birmingham earlier that year, Dallas County answered with Sheriff Clark leading more than 200 posse men to help. There was no doubt that a move on Selma would be met with violence. September 23, 1963. The day after the bombing, 63 protesters had been arrested in Selma, including several who were beaten by the police. Sheriff Clark and Al Lingo of the Alabama State Troopers led the brutal response, which provoked local teenagers to picket the next day in front of the county courthouse. It was the first time anyone in Selma had ever dared to challenge Sheriff Clark on his own doorstep. The picketers were arrested, but now a movement was afoot. Nightly mass meetings began. Local black leaders requested that military personnel from nearby Craig Air Force Base no longer be allowed to take leave in Selma, since the city was defying federal law by enforcing segregation. The request was ignored. As chairman of SNCC, I sent a telegram to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara describing what was happening. The Defense Secretary's office responded by saying the base commander may not intervene in behalf of persons not under his command. With that curt dismissal, I decided it was time to join the people in Selma. John, Jim, glad you made it. Me too. Has the meeting started? Yes, they're ready for you. Joined this evening by the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Chairman John Lewis. Thank you, Deacon. My brothers and sisters, as I said a few weeks ago at the March on Washington, one man, one vote is the African cry. It must be our cry too. So I say to you today, we are going to stay here in Selma until every person of color can register and vote. In Selma, and throughout most of the South at that time, it was almost impossible for African Americans to register to vote. In Dallas County, only 2.1% of African Americans of voting age were registered. I'd like to register to vote. Sure, let me get the forms for you. There were many different ways to stop people from voting. I'd like to register to vote, please. I see. Wait here. Here you go. Let me know if you have any questions. In some places, African Americans were asked to count the number of jelly beans in a jar, or the number of bubbles in a jar of soap. The registrar of voters held all of the power and could decide to waive or strictly enforce any of the rules at any time for any reason. Oops, you forgot one. Good catch. Here is your registration form and also your literacy test. It is in 3 parts. Questions in the last section should be answered in the form of an essay. This included literacy tests, often only given to black applicants. Here you go. Thanks. Have a great day. Tap, 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 tap. They were filled with questions meant to trip up even the smartest person, but not everyone had to take them. You're taking too long. You fail. Get out of here. Crumple. Even if a black citizen were able to register, their name would be printed in the local paper, making them a target. The White Citizens Council could pressure their employer to fire them. Their house could be burned down by the KKK, or worse. September 24, 1963. The next demonstration in front of the Dallas County Courthouse resulted in 30 arrests, so we responded with an even larger protest. I participated along with a group of students from Selma University. Don't y'all ever learn? Move along now. Oof. It was the first time I was arrested in Selma. Move! But it would not be the last. We were all charged with unlawful assembly and taken to the Selma prison farm. Boom! Enjoy. Thunk. It was weeks before I was released. October 7, 1963. In Dallas County, you could only register to vote on the first and third Mondays of the month. So while I was in jail, SNCC decided to use the next voter registration day to stage its largest mobilization yet. The effort quickly found a name: Freedom Day. The federal government is not doing what it is supposed to do. Even renowned author James Baldwin came with his brother to support those in line. It was hot, but no one was allowed to leave the line for water or to use the bathroom. Even if they could, the colored bathrooms had been locked. At noon, the registrar of voters left for a 2-hour lunch break. By that time, only 12 people had been admitted to see the registrar. 15 minutes later, the Alabama state troopers arrived. Thud, thud. Major Joe Smelly was the trooper in charge that day. If any of y'all leaves that line for any reason, if you have to go to the bathroom, or if you're thirsty, any reason whatsoever, you're not coming back, you hear? And you agitators, you're not allowed to bring him anything. No food, no water. It became a battle of wills. After a few more hours, some folks standing in line were looking like they might collapse. Sheriff Clark. Finally, Jim Foreman and Amelia Boynton, a local businesswoman who had been organizing registration efforts here for decades, made an appeal. Sheriff Clark, these people could die. Let us bring them some water. Some haven't had anything to drink in 5 or 6 hours. Sheriff Clark, it doesn't seem like a very Christian thing to let people drop dead on your courthouse steps. If they're so thirsty, then they can get out of line and get something to drink. Ain't nobody stopping them. But if I see any of you trying to bring them anything, if I see you as much as talking to them, I'll arrest you for molesting people trying to register to vote. 2 SNCC field secretaries, Avery Williams and Chico Neblett, couldn't wait any longer. Thud! Thwack! Still, the line held and no one left. That's it! 4:30. The courthouse is closed. To us, making it through the entire day without a mass arrest was progress. Though only a few people were able to see the registrar, we felt it was a victory. After I was released from the Selma prison farm, my duties as chairman of SNCC took me away from Selma to all parts of the country. I was given speeches, but I was also raising money. My brothers and sisters, all of us must get in the revolution. After the March on Washington, a substantial amount of money was made available to different groups within the movement. But Roy Wilkins in particular saw to it that the formula for distributing these funds would send the most to organizations that already had money, like his NAACP. We must get in the streets of every city, every village, every town of this nation. SNCC had already been growing apart from the mainstream of the movement. We were younger, and by their accounts, more radical. But the amount of funding we received was a small fraction of what other groups received, and it only served to widen the divide. Until true freedom comes to every being, we must seek more than civil rights. We must seek love, peace, and true brotherhood. But within SNCC, there was always a distrust of money, and the strings that were often attached. If it came down to money or our independence, well, we could always make do without much money. Meanwhile, Diane's idea for an all-out assault did not fade away. It began to take shape in another form, and in another state, Mississippi. It was led by Bob Moses, who had spent the last 3 years in the state organizing SNCC chapters. He was also head of the Council of Federated Organizations, a coalition of SNCC, SCLC, CORE, and NAACP activists for coordinating voting rights efforts. Moses was becoming increasingly well known in the movement. Smart and gentle, he avoided the spotlight partly as a personal philosophy, and partly because being too well known in Mississippi could be deadly. He had a graduate degree from Harvard, but like many of us, Bob started wearing overalls to show solidarity with the farmers and rural folks we were working with. With Al Lowenstein, a white activist and former dean at Stanford University, Moses conceived of a mock election to take place in Mississippi at the same time as the actual statewide elections. Lowenstein had compared the conditions in Mississippi to those in South Africa under apartheid, so he and Bob Moses modeled their idea after a similar effort by South African activists. As SNCC organized the effort, we gave it a name: Freedom Vote. The plan was to stage our own election with our own candidates. This would give black women and men a sense of what it was like to actually vote, and dramatize the exclusion of African Americans from the electoral process. At the end of October, I went to Mississippi to help with final preparations for the Freedom Vote and speak throughout the state, encouraging people to participate. It was my first time in Jackson since the Freedom Ride.